In the waning days of the Roman Republic, two titans dominated its political landscape: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Both had achieved renown on the battlefield and forged their ambitions in conquest. Their alliance in the First Triumvirate, formed in 60 BC alongside the immensely wealthy Crassus, was a calculated maneuver to seize control of the Republic's machinery. Pompey contributed military prestige, Crassus financial power, and Caesar relentless ambition. But the coalition was temporary. Crassus's death in Parthia in 53 BC, and Caesar's sweeping victories in Gaul upset the balance. Caesar emerged not just as a consul or general, but as a national force. Pompey, increasingly alarmed, drifted towards the Optimates, the Senate's conservative faction. Meanwhile, social unrest surged. Plebeians demanded land reform, veterans sought pensions, and political violence roiled the streets. When Caesar's daughter Julia, Pompey's wife, died in childbirth in 54 BC, the last personal bond between them dissolved. The Republic's ancient checks and balances, designed for a city-state, were overwhelmed by expansion, inequality, and corruption. As ambition collided with instability, war was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The political structure of the Republic was no longer agile enough to adapt. Generals held more sway than senators, laws bent to ambition. As each side armed itself with propaganda and private militias, the question was no longer who would win the next election, but who would survive the next coup. On January 10, 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with the 13th Legion. He violated one of Rome's most sacred laws. No general could bring troops into Italy. The moment was not taken lightly. According to tradition, Caesar paused before crossing and declared, "The die is cast." The Senate, under Pompey's influence, had stripped Caesar of immunity and ordered his return as a private citizen. Facing ruin and trial, Caesar chose war, but it wasn't just self-preservation. It was a carefully orchestrated political message. He framed his march as a crusade against a corrupt elite. His men followed not only out of loyalty, but out of belief. They had conquered Gaul with him, shared spoils, and built lives upon his leadership. As he marched south, town after town surrendered without resistance. Roman officials defected. The Senate panicked. Pompey, caught unprepared, evacuated Rome and regrouped in Brundisium. Within weeks, Caesar had captured the capital without a single pitched battle. The Republic's institutions were not defeated with force. They simply fled before it. Caesar knew that once crossed, there was no turning back. Every step southward was a direct challenge to the old order, but his gamble was calculated. The Senate's fear had made him an outlaw, but to the masses, Caesar was a savior Defying aristocratic arrogance, Pompey's retreat signaled not just military unpreparedness, but a psychological blow to Republican confidence. Pompey withdrew across the Adriatic to consolidate strength. From the east, he could summon vast wealth, client kings, and experienced legions. Yet, despite his resources, his coalition was fragile. An army held together by aristocratic prestige and promises. Caesar knew this. He marched west, subduing Pompey's legions in Spain with a speed that stunned Rome. Then, braving storms and a naval blockade, he crossed to Greece in winter, an act of military audacity. He landed with a small force, but was soon reinforced. His troops, hardened by years of combat in Gaul and loyalty to Caesar, moved with discipline unmatched by their opponents. Pompey, by contrast, relied on noble officers who often lacked battlefield experience. While Pompey had numbers, Caesar had momentum and unity. His men didn't just serve a general, they followed a symbol. And symbols in Rome carry power equal to armies. Morale in Caesar's army soared. Letters from the front told of a general who slept in the open, marched with his men, and shared their hunger. This was more than strategy. It was identity. Caesar's legions believed they were building a new Rome, not merely defending the old. By spring of 48 BC, the armies faced each other near Dyrrhachium. Caesar, recognizing he was outnumbered, sought to contain Pompey with a bold strategy. He constructed miles of sieged fortifications to trap Pompey near the coast. For weeks, Caesar's men labored under pressure, rationing supplies, building trenches, and enduring constant raids. They were exhausted, but held the line. Pompey eventually found a gap in Caesar's fortifications and launched a breakout. Caesar's lines buckled. His men retreated. It was a tactical defeat, but not a rout. His soldiers withdrew in good order, and morale remained high. Pompey's overly cautious failed to capitalize. In his restraint, Caesar found hope. Even in defeat, his armies held firm, and now they would fight not just for victory, but for redemption. In that brutal standoff, survival was the only measure of victory. Caesar's retreat was not marked by collapse, but by discipline. His soldiers withdrew in ranks, still fighting, still loyal. For many, it was proof that Caesar could endure anything, even defeat. Later that summer, the decisive confrontation took place at Pharsalus. Pompey's armies, nearly double Caesar's in size, backed by the Senate and foreign auxiliaries, he positioned himself defensively, but Caesar, as always, was bold. Before the battle, he walked among his men, offering not threats, but purpose. He reminded them they were not just soldiers, but saviors of Rome. When Pompey's cavalry advanced on Caesar's flank, Caesar unveiled his hidden reserve line, infantry specifically trained to counter cavalry. The maneuver worked. Pompey's flank collapsed. Panic spread. and Caesar's armies surged forward. Pompey fled the battlefield, shedding his general's cloak for civilian clothes. It was not just a military collapse, it was a psychological one. The myth of Pompey had been broken, and with it, the legitimacy of the Republican cause. The battle's aftermath stunned the Roman world. Thousands were captured, tens of thousands dead, but Caesar showed clemency. He pardoned many, including senators and knights. This policy of forgiveness was both humane and politically brilliant. It turned enemies into dependents and made further resistance appear futile. Pompey sought sanctuary in Egypt, hoping for aid from the boy king Ptolemy XIII. But Egypt, engulfed in its own dynastic crisis, saw opportunity instead of refuge. Pompey was murdered at the shore by former comrades now in Egyptian service. His head was severed and sent to Caesar, who arrived days later. The scene was one of political theater. Caesar reportedly turned away in horror, weeping at the sight of his former ally's death. To some, it was genuine grief. To others, brilliant propaganda. In aligning with Cleopatra, both politically and romantically, Caesar gained control of Egypt's grain and wealth. Securing the East, Pompey, once Rome's greatest general, had died, not in battle, but in exile, unarmed and betrayed. The Republic had no funeral for him. History did. The shock of Pompey's death rippled across the Mediterranean. A man once held as the conqueror of the East had been struck down like a common fugitive. For Rome's elite, it was a warning. Exile brought no safety, and defeat no dignity. With Pompey gone, Caesar turned to mop up the remaining embers of resistance. In a whirlwind of campaigns across Asia, Africa, and Spain, he defeated every remaining senatorial force. He was now master of Rome, in name and in fact. Appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, he wielded unchecked authority. Yet Caesar, ever the reformer, did not rule by terror alone. He restructured debt, expanded the Senate, revised the calendar, and launched ambitious building projects. He offered clemency to former enemies, including Brutus and Cassius. To the people, he was a savior. To the elite, a tyrant. The Senate's power became ceremonial. Elections continued, but only with Caesar's approval. He wore no crown, but power radiated from him. Rome had become something new, not a republic of citizens, but a realm ruled by one man's vision. Yet beneath Caesar's reforms lurked a troubling truth. The more power he centralized, the more isolated he became. His control of grain, coinage, and military command made him indispensable, but also a target. Even those he had spared whispered in corners, uneasy under the weight of gratitude owed to a single man. The rivalry between Caesar and Pompey was more than a personal feud. It was a test of Rome's soul. Pompey represented the old republic, a world of aristocratic privilege and Senate tradition. Caesar embodied a new Rome, populist, militarized, dynamic, and dangerously centralized. Their clash illuminated the fault lines within Roman society: inequality, urban unrest, elite corruption, and political stagnation. Caesar's victory did not simply end a war. It exposed that the Republic had long since decayed from within. The institutions were hollow. The laws were tools of the powerful. The people, disillusioned, found stability in singular rule. What followed would be 5 centuries of emperors, some wise, many cruel, all heirs to the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. In choosing sides, Rome chose its fate. In memory of that choice, we study not just how the Republic fell, but why it could not survive. The echoes of the Civil War stretch far beyond antiquity. It was not merely a contest of arms, but of visions. Who Rome was and what she was becoming, every republic since has wrestled with the same dilemma: how to balance liberty with stability, ambition with order. In Caesar's triumph lay both Rome's salvation and its undoing.